In the past decade, psychology has gone through some enormous changes in how scientists in this field do their work and in how they interact with each other. In this video, I'm going to talk about how, in the past decade, psychology has gone through a crisis and into what's now sometimes been called a revolution in credibility. So the year 2011 was a big year. It was a big year in the world at large. It's the last time wide-legged pants were in fashion. They're coming back, I hear. I wouldn't know. And in 2011, the big #1 song was LMFAO's Party Rock Anthem. You probably remember that one too. But 2011 was also a big year in psychology. It was a big year in part because of the publication of a paper by this man, social psychologist Daryl Bem. Daryl Bem was a well-respected and prolific social psychologist who'd published many important papers and studies over the years. But he'd always had kind of a side interest, a sort of personal interest in ESP, extrasensory perception. And in 2011, he published a paper in one of the leading journals in social and personality psychology called the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The title of this paper was Feeling the Future, Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect, which is a fancy way of saying being able to tell the future. Bem's paper had 9 experiments with over 1,000 subjects, and all these experiments showed support for precognition or presentiment, which are fancy terms for ESP. As I said, Bem was a widely respected researcher, and so when this paper came out, very few people thought that this was fraud. People who knew Bem knew he had been interested in this for a while, and everyone, or virtually everyone, myself included, believed that this work was done by him in good faith and in earnest. It was published in a top psychology journal after peer review, which was also quite noteworthy, and I'll get into that in a moment, how that happened. And there were no obvious methodological or statistical flaws. This is how it got published through peer review. So things looked like business as usual, but it was an impossible result by most people's reckoning. So what happened? So at first, I remember when this paper came out, and actually before the paper was published, people were kind of emailing an early version around going, what's going on here? And I think most people's first reaction was, he must have done something wrong, and there must be like one big thing that he made a mistake on. Maybe he didn't do correct blinding of his subjects, maybe he analyzed his data wrong, but as people poured over the paper, they couldn't find that one silver bullet that took down all 9 studies. In fact, by all appearances, the paper looked like what everyone else was doing, and when the journal editors were asked, look, why did you publish this paper? That's kind of what they said. They said, look, we don't necessarily believe in ESP, but we think we have to be open-minded. This looks like the same standard of evidence we use to judge everything else. As a result of this, people started to ask, well, if you can get an impossible result with the same thing other people are doing, could there be something wrong with what everyone else is doing? And this led to a lot of psychologists to start re-examining old findings to say, is it possible that the way we've been checking for evidence might have some holes or some flaws in it? And so people began running what are called replications, where they collected new data with an old protocol of an existing study to see if they could get the same result again. One early example of this was some influential research by a social psychologist named John Bargh. Bargh had theorized that thinking about a stereotype makes you act in stereotype-consistent ways. It activates the concept in your memory. And he had published an experiment showing evidence for this, but in 2012, researchers tried to replicate this, and they couldn't get the effect. And this was an early sign that maybe there are some of these findings out there in the literature. Starting in 2011, a large-scale multi-lab collaboration began. A team of over 270 researchers set out to replicate 100 studies that have been published in top journals in psychology, mostly in cognitive and social psychology and a few other areas as well. What they found was that only a minority of these studies could be successfully replicated. There were some shortcomings of this. It was generally a good study, but people figured out, well, maybe if we have some larger sample sizes, we'll detect more. That turned out to be the case. But as things stand today, the big picture is that there have been many now of these large-scale replication projects, hundreds of individual replication studies. And a consistent result is, even though some of the time people can get the original result, a large enough percentage of the time people can't that it causes some worry for scientists, wondering is our published record as reliable as we're assuming it is when we try to build on it? And in fact, similar conclusions have been drawn in other fields. So it's not only psychology, it's not just because we're not a hard science or whatever BS people say. People have seen similar kinds of issues crop up in biology, in economics, in medicine, other fields. And this has led to public headlines, both about psychology and about other fields. So this has gotten some public attention. And in fact, scientists themselves came to agree in the middle of the last decade, around the 20-teens, that yes, there's some kind of a reproducibility crisis. Some scientists, a small majority, said yes, a significant crisis. A large number also said yes, at least a slight crisis. Scientists in the 20-teens across a variety of fields got worried that they weren't able to replicate as many findings as they want to. So what went wrong? How is it the case that among published studies, not all of them are replicable? Well, I should say before I dive into these reasons that nobody ever thought they should all be replicable. Science, by its very nature, is pushing the boundaries, trying to discover new things. You have to take risks. Sometimes they're going to be wrong. But I think a lot of scientists thought they were wrong more often than they should be. This wasn't within the level of tolerable or acceptable failures or shortcomings. This was a little bit more. And scientists began digging in. And the consensus today is that there were at least two major culprits. One was undisclosed flexibility during data collection and analysis. So a group of researchers who were very important early on in highlighting this problem, when they looked back, they said everyone knew it was wrong, these kinds of flexibility, but they thought it was wrong the way it's wrong to jaywalk. We decided to write about this when our analyses revealed it was wrong the way it's wrong to rob a bank. The other culprit that people have identified is selective reporting or publication bias. So you remember earlier in this course, I told you that in order to get published, a paper has to get through this peer review process, and then an editor has to decide, yes, it's worth publishing. Well, journals and editors and reviewers like new, exciting discoveries better than they like sort of repeating an old thing or just showing that we were wrong about something. And so, as a result, the journals have an incomplete record of the research that's being done. If you show something new and exciting, it's easier to get published than if you try to repeat somebody else's experiment. So people often don't even bother trying. And so, for example, in one of the top journals in psychology, covering all sub-areas of psychology, one of the previous editors had written that work that was well done and useful, but not sufficiently groundbreaking, was grounds for being rejected from that journal. So this all sounds pretty bad, but I'm not here to tell you that psychology sucks and that you should give up on it, because immediately alongside and following a lot of these revelations and discoveries, there has been hope, there's been change, and the field has begun embarking on what's going to continue to be a major transformation in how psychologists do their work, and it's alongside how people in other fields are doing their work as well. So in the past decade, people observing psychology and people observing other scientific fields have talked about a social movement, an open science movement towards greater transparency and openness in the sciences. Those three researchers I mentioned that were important in pointing out some of the early problems have more recently said that psychology is undergoing a renaissance of research methods. And Samin Vazir, another psychologist who's written a lot about this work, has referred to the present period as a credibility revolution. That in spotting a number of these problems, psychologists and other scientists have begun to change how they do their work. So what has changed? Well, one has been the growth of a new area of work that's come to be called metascience. For a long time, philosophers, sociologists, and others have done very important work looking at science, looking at psychology and other fields, how they work, identifying how they work, identifying how they might work better. And now scientists themselves have joined in and begun doing science on science, doing experiments, doing surveys, creating models and theories of the scientific process, to try to understand how science works, testing interventions to see how can we make it better. As one person who's been very active in this work, James Heathers, has pointed out, people for a long time said science is self-correcting, but the answer is, well, yeah, if we correct it, not because of magical progress. And so scientists have begun taking more seriously this idea of correcting and improving the processes. It's now become more common to do replication studies. So as I said, until not very long ago, It was difficult to get a replication study published, and so scientists were less likely to try than they might otherwise have been. Journals have started adopting principles that say that we will publish replications of the work in our own journals. Researchers have started getting together to replicate one another's work in networks and coordinating across multiple sites. And so there are now more and more of these replication studies to try to understand both individual findings, whether they replicate, as well as more generally, what are the qualities, what are the features that make a study more likely to replicate. Another thing that scientists have started doing is something called preregistration. This is something that if you go on to take Psychology 302, our statistics class, you'll learn more about. And here the idea is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the culprits was having flexibility in how we analyze data. Flexibility in a lot of ways can be good because not every study works the way you intended it to at the start. You have to be adaptive. Real science is messy. It's not those magic eureka moments in the movies. But what people realized was that useful flexibility that scientists had was alongside some less useful flexibility that allowed scientists' biases to creep into the process, even though they didn't even want them to themselves. And so pre-registration is a way of creating a time-stamped public record of decisions about how to analyze data, so that when you're analyzing the data, you aren't influenced by looking at it and saying, well, if I do it this way, it'll come out in a way that's more likely to get me published than if I do it that way. And so this is something that has begun to be embraced as a way of analyzing data better. Another innovation has been something called registered reports. They combine this idea of pre-registration with a publication process that guarantees that the editors and reviewers also won't make those kinds of biased decisions. So in a registered report, what happens is scientists will create a plan for how they're going to do the research, and then that's what gets peer reviewed by the editor and the reviewers. They look at the plan, they say, is this an interesting question? Is this a good way of going about answering it? If so, we will commit that if you do what you said you're going to do, we will publish it no matter how the results come out. And so what this means is that the published record of registered reports, which are increasingly becoming a more common method of publication in psychology, this published record is less biased. And this is from a recent audit study that found that with standard reports, they looked to see how often was the first tested hypothesis supported or not supported by the data. And with standard reports, this was over 95% of the time the first reported hypothesis was supported. With these registered reports, it's more like 45% or so of the time. And so what this suggests is that registered reports might be creating a less biased record. There have been a lot of other openness and transparency initiatives in the sciences, and if you go on to do research yourself, you will probably be doing some of this in your own work. So there's now a lot more technological infrastructure for sharing the products of science so that we can see more about the methods that people used. Journal policies are changing so that journals are now incentivizing people to collect larger samples, which are more reliable and more precise. And as I said, changing these policies to encourage more replications and registered reports. And a growth area in psychology, which I mentioned last week, has been preprints, which allow scientists to publish their results without going through journals so that they can create a complete scientific record. And thinking back to an earlier video where I talked about this idea of organized skepticism from Merton, the idea that scientists don't just practice their critical faculties on their own, but they get together to do them, we're now seeing professional societies of scientists, in some cases being created. There's one called the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. It's a relatively new scientific society that works specifically on these kinds of issues. We're also seeing long-standing, very august bodies of prestigious people like the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine getting into the game and saying, how can we coordinate across different parts of the system to make science even more robust than it has been? Now, as I said earlier, none of this is reason not to trust science that has come before. This is scientists doing what science is supposed to be about, self-correcting, looking at not just specific findings and saying, can we improve them, but also looking at the methods, the ways they produce knowledge, and saying, can we make these even better than they have been before? Okay, thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to do the concept check questions, and I'll see you next time.